Mute it. Okay, good afternoon and good evening, depending on which part of Asia you are, and good morning where you are right now. And welcome to this webinar on COVID-19 and the migrants in Asia, being organized jointly by the Asian Population Association and International Institute for Population Sciences, Mumbai. I'm K.S. James, Director and Senior Professor at the International Institute for Population Sciences, Mumbai, and also a council member of the Asian Population Association. It's my great honor for me to host this webinar on behalf of the APA and IIPS Mumbai. I'm extremely delighted to moderate this session alongside a very distinguished set of panelists who will be presenting their perspective on this important issue today. Friends, it is now nearly 9 months or 10 months that we started fighting with COVID-19, which has been a public health emergency all over the world. The pandemic has spared no country in the world, and some are still fighting with it. Others are in the recovery mode, while a few others are experiencing a resurgence of the pandemic. From the beginning, many Asian countries experienced an exponential rise in the case, and countries like India are still worst affected among them. Now, COVID-19 not only disrupted essential public health services, but the ripple effect of this pandemic has a major impact economically, politically, and how even people live their day-to-day life. Normally, the impact of pandemics are studied, discussed, and debated in terms of its effect on mortality or disability. I think perhaps COVID-19 has been a complete exception to this general trend, because compared to mortality dimensions, COVID-19 raised considerable interest in terms of migration and particularly the migrants. And it adversely affected the lower strata of the society, where migrants form a major proportion, particularly in the Asian context. The UN wider estimates are mind-boggling in this respect. COVID-19 alone can push as high as almost 500 million people in the developing countries to poverty. The World Bank estimates this number as 177 million, of which around 71 million to push them to extreme poverty. Therefore, there is an urgent need for policy action to cushion its consequences, to protect vulnerable population, particularly the migrants. It is critical to address the challenges posed by informality and limited safety nets, particularly the Asian context. And it is also important to improve the country's capacity to cope up with such adverse consequences of any pandemics in the future. The base of any policy formulation is a strong database and clear understanding of this issue. And we now feel immense need for more such studies, discussions, debates in the area of impact of pandemics on migration. I think migration studies has now become sort of indispensable discipline in the context of a pandemic. This panel primarily aims to generate such knowledge, understanding, and engage in a discussion and debate on these important dimensions. And we are fortunate to have a very distinguished set of speakers today. We will organize the webinar in the following way. The panelists, each of them will speak around 20 minutes each. However, you may keep your suggestions and questions to the panelists in the chat box anytime during their lecture. Your questions will be taken up by the panelists only at the end of the complete session. I think our first speaker today is Dr. Ravi Srivastava, who is currently the professor and director of the Center for Employment Studies, Institute for Human Development, New Delhi. Prior to joining here, he was a professor at the Center for Study of Regional Development at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Dr. Ravi has a PhD from Cambridge Cambridge University, UK, and extensively worked on issues of labor, employment, migration, social protection, poverty, informality, regional development, and human development. He has over 5 books and numerous research papers in this area. Dr. Devi has been consultant to many international organizations, UN, ILO, World Bank, etc. He has been a member of various committees in India. Of these, most important among them is the member of the National Commission for the Enterprises, the Unorganized Sector, which has made a mark by its landmark suggestions on the informal labor in the country. Today, the Dr. Devi will speak on the pandemic, economic crisis, and the migrants in Asia. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Devi to this panel discussion. And over to you, Dr. Devi Srivastava, for your talk. Dr. Devi, you are muted still.
Yeah, okay. No, I'm okay now. Yeah. You can hear me now? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. You can go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. James and the Asian Population Association for inviting me to this seminar and to this webinar. I think what we are facing in the world today is possibly an unprecedented situation historically. And I think we still have not yet, the world that we live in and the impact of the crisis has still not fully sunk in into all of us. As you rightly pointed out, pandemics, and we of course think of the Spanish flu when we think of the present pandemic, do cause a serious, serious disruption in lives and create a lot of mortality. In fact, we are today meeting just when we have crossed the 1 million mortality mark as far as this pandemic is concerned. But more than that, this particular pandemic, the impact, it's of course it has the response to the pandemic via lockdowns has created a situation which has impacted on the economies worldwide, creating perhaps the most serious economic crisis that we have ever known. We still don't know whether the crisis will surpass the Great Depression, but certainly we are going to get close to it. Now, the one result of the response to this crisis was, or rather, the immediate response was the lockdown, and the lockdown resulted in immobility of mobile populations, whether refugees or migrant workers, documented or undocumented, or students and everybody else, with very serious consequences. And then there are those these consequences are going to stay with us for some time because of the ensuing economic crisis. And I'm going to pinpoint some of these issues as I broadly give an overview of the pandemic and the issue of Asian migrants. I'll broadly begin with talking about international migrants, and then talk about internal migrants. And many of you would have seen internal migrants on Indian roads, the enormous crisis that we face in India, which was a very manifest crisis, but similar crises have been there, less manifest in many other countries in Asia. So please carry on with the slides. I'll just ask you to change whenever. Yeah. Next slide, please. So the discovery of the corona COV2 virus in January 2020 rapidly led to a global pandemic. Most countries responded with a lockdown restricting travel and immobilizing people. This greatly affected mobile and migratory populations, including workers, refugees, students, and others. The lockdown has had immediate and far-reaching effects on the growth of Asian economies, leading to cutback in employment and salaries, affecting most of all low-skilled precarious workers in the informal economy. This in turn has a major impact on international internal migrant workers, both returned and at potential destinations. Next, please. So migrants originating from Asia and the Pacific account for 1/3 of migrant workers worldwide in 2019. And the major destination regions for Asian migrants include Asia and the Middle East. Together, they account for almost 62% of migrants, international migrants. In 2019, 6 of the 10 largest remittance recipients globally were from this region: India, the People's Republic of China, Philippines, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Vietnam. Highest remittance to GDP ratios are in some of the Pacific and Central Asian countries, along with Nepal, Philippines, and Bangladesh. Of the world's more than 70 million forcibly displaced people, including refugees, asylum seekers, displaced persons, and other forced migrants, many live in Asia in countries such as Iran, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Thailand. The Asian Development Bank estimates employment in Asia and the Pacific to be lower by as much as 167 million persons should containment measures last 6 months. And they've already lasted 6 months from the time when the outbreak first intensified. Destination regions have been devastated by the economic impacts of the pandemic, with the economic output in these economies projected to contract by almost 6.7 to 10.2% in 2020. Next, please. So if you look at, and this is a 6-month average of the Oxford University Stringency Index. And if you look at the degree of stringency, which is measured by lockdowns and other measures, which would have affected the mobility of population, even over the whole entire 6 months from March to September till date, you can see that the lockdowns and the restrictions on mobility were very high in most countries across the region. Nepal, 83.5 on a 1 to 100 index, Philippines 80.9, India 78, China 76.4, Bangladesh 75.5, and all that. So the very high levels of stringency, lockdowns, and immobilizations across the whole region. Next, please. Now, with every successive growth estimates, the estimates are being revised downwards. The World Bank has already done this twice. The IMF has done this twice. Every successive estimates are revising the growth projections downwards. What I have done in this is taken the latest projections made by the OECD, because the OECD projections have been made in August of this year. And if you look at it, the world GDP is expected to decline by minus 7.7% in 2020 and grow by 1.6% in 2021, which means at the end of 2021, the global GDP will be still 5 to 6% lower than what it was at the beginning of 2020. And then you can go down and look at the other areas. For example, emerging market and developing economy, minus 6.6% in 2020, only 0.3% in 2021. East Asia and the Pacific, minus 5.2% and 1%. South Asia, if you look at South Asia, minus 8.2% in 2020 and minus 3.1% in 2021. So the negative growth rate is expected to continue in the case of South Asia over the next year. And if you look at specific countries, China has done, as we know, China and Vietnam will do a little better than other countries, and yet China will have almost a 5% negative growth rate in 2020, only a 1% growth rate in 2021. Indonesia minus 5.1% 2020. Saudi Arabia, which is also a major destination, minus 5.7% and only 0.3% growth rate in 2021. India minus 9% expected growth rate in 2020 and minus 3% in 2021. Pakistan minus 5% and minus 3.2%. Bangladesh minus 5.6% and minus 6%. So this is the situation which is going to carry over both 2020 and 2021. Most countries will not have retrieved the level of output at the end of 2021 as they had at the beginning of 2020. Next, please. And if you look at international migration, the quantum of migration country-wise is broadly known to us. What is more important is the kind of, and also their importance in terms of percentage of GDP in many countries across the region. So it ranges, Bangladesh 5.8%, India, the highest remittance receiver, but as a percentage of GDP, 2.8%. Nepal, 27%. Pakistan, almost 8%. Vietnam, 6.5%. Sri Lanka, 7.8%. Many countries, the remittance GDP ratio is extraordinarily high. But then if you look at the projected losses, and these are the projected losses made by the World Bank in April of this year, they'll be revised down. The World Bank will be coming up with a revised estimate on the 20th of October. But these are the estimates made in April. And you see Bangladesh 27.8% decline in remittance, China 18%, India 23.5%, Indonesia 21.4%, Nepal 28.7%, Pakistan 27%, Philippines 20%, Vietnam 18%, Sri Lanka 21%, Thailand 16%. So enormous decline in remittances in most major Asian remittance dependence economies. Next, please. These are actually ADB estimates, and ADB estimates have been made in August. They're much more recent estimates, and ADB has modeled three scenarios: a baseline scenario, a median scenario, and a worst case scenario. ADB's worst case scenario is closer to World Bank's April forecast. So the worst case scenario in the case of ADB is minus 18% for the world, and as when the World Bank's was minus 20%. But the baseline scenario, it is minus 10%. For Asia, however, it is minus 20% for Asia. That is the worst case scenario. And the baseline scenario is minus 11.5%. And then if you look at region-wise, for Central Asia, minus 16% baseline, minus 24%. South Asia, except South Asia, South Asia, it is minus 16% in the baseline scenario and minus 25% in the worst case scenario. So among the regions in Asia, basically South Asia is forecast to have the worst losses, the largest losses in remittances overall. Next, please. So I think this is something I will not belabor. We know that region-wise, different parts of Asia have different, the importance of different destinations are there. So, for example, if you look at Central Asia and Southeast Asia, Southern Asia, then it's West Asia and then Central and Southern Asia and so on. If we look at Eastern and Southeastern Asia, then again, in the Eastern and Southeastern Asia, so there's a lot of intra-regional movement as far as Southeast Asia is concerned. Then also North America is an important destination and so on. So this is a region-wise picture as far as Asian regions is concerned. And this is important when we look at the next slide. Next, please. Yeah, so I'm going to just, I'm going to now basically look at the four broad areas of concern that we have, beginning with the impact of migrants at destination. And I'm going to list broad checklists of issues and go into any issue, if possible, later on. The first is the whole question of COVID and health-related issues. And we know that migrant health and livelihoods are a significant risk from COVID-19 due to congested living conditions, lack of insurance and affordable access to health measures. Then the question of employment, shelter and food, which of course is the most major concern for migrants living abroad. Then there is a question which has been highlighted in a number of South Asian countries, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, the question of wage loss and wage theft. A number of migrant returnees have reported withholding of wages by employers, with reported cases actually increasing threefold over last year. The important question of forced repatriation and visa issues, visa extension problems, forced repatriations, and isolating migrants and refugees in congested dormitories and prisons have been reported from across the region. Difficulties in sending and receiving remittances, and xenophobic reaction to their presence. Next, please. Then the difficulty in migrants returning under the present circumstances to their home countries. And this is basically, first of all, because has been an impact of travel restriction and border closures. So countries responded with border closures and and travel restrictions with adverse consequences for migrants and refugees without sources of support. Even after partial easing, there has been restricted travel. So, for example, very, very few flights are flying between the destination and source countries even now. And therefore, workers at destination continue to remain immobile and highly vulnerable. And the third, of course, major issue is the cost of travel and migrants, how the migrants are able to raise resources for travel. Because in most cases, they have to raise the cost of the travel. And in many cases, they have relied on formal and informal loans to cover the cost of the recruitment and travel, which will have to be repaid in cases where employment has been cut short. Next, please. Then we come to the returning migrants. A large number of them have returned. Probably, the estimates are very, very wild just now, but certainly more than 4 million migrants have already returned. And the point I think what needs to be made is that the percentage of migrants who have returned are still not more than 20 to 30% of the potential migrants who could return. So most of the migrants are still, as it were, stranded at destinations. Now, with their returns to their home, because of the effect, with their returns, the entire difficulty they have faced is being compounded by the lack of remittances at the household level and, of course, at the economy-wide level. This increases the unemployment burden at the national levels, which will be quite significant in the high migrating regions and countries. Returning migrants many of them still have to pay off their debts to recruiting agents or moneylenders, and they will be particularly vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, and will be among those most in need of services and support. And finally, of course, they face social stigmatization and need psychosocial support. Next, please. So what concerns us, of course, is also the future prospects of these migrants. The COVID-19 crisis is expected to wipe out 6.7% working hours globally in the second quarter of 2020, equivalent to about 195 million full-time workers. ILO projections suggest that that labor market recovery during the second half of 2020, which we are now in, will be uncertain and incomplete. Working hour losses will be as high as 11.9%, equivalent to 340 million full-time jobs. So the basic issues here are employment prospects as destination regions, particularly the oil-producing regions, could face a protracted recovery affecting employment. The sectors most at risk include accommodation and food services, manufacturing, retail, and business and administrative services. And at origin, there is a negative impact on income and employment, which varies across countries, and also the nature of the economic policies and stimulus which they have been provided. Source countries will have to proactively work to create an economic environment appropriate for migrants. Next, please. So just broad, many of these policies are being followed, but I'm putting them forward in the form of recommendations. One is the question of suspending forced returns. And this has been, recommended by a number of, organizations. Several governments have also implemented flexible measures, policies such as blanket visa restrictions and the waiver of penalties, among other measures, until lockdown and travel restrictions are lifted, to ensure that migrants do not fall into irregular situations. Second, much more active consular access and bilateral discussions. So various challenges and capacity gaps have prevented some governments from providing effective large-scale immigration and consular assistance amidst ongoing crisis. Promising initiatives have included the setup of hotlines and online mechanisms for information as well as support. Third is the question of income and food support. Some governments have taken measures to include migrants regardless of their status in wage subsidy and emergency stipend schemes. The Philippines has included refugees and stateless persons in social support schemes. Then the access to health facilities. Many governments at destination are allowing migrants, regardless of their migratory status or insurance, to have access to medical facilities, particularly those dedicated to COVID-19. Then the question of remittances, development of time-bound programs designed to stimulate and incentivize sending of remittances, and finally, flexibility in seeking employment. Governments can permit, and some have, permit to unemployed migrants to seek employment in other areas, such as core activities, care activities and others, where there is an continuing demand for workers, wherever there is possible shortages. Next, please. So as far as internal migrants is concerned, in many countries in Asia, the number of such internal migrants, including seasonal and circular migrants, is very large and concentrated in the informal sector and in industries such as construction, hospitality, and tourism and trade. Their impact spreads across a larger number of families in source areas across many countries. In India, estimates from 2007-8, and these are the last estimates that we have, show that seven times as many households received remittances as international migrants, and the total size of the internal remittances were twice as large as international remittances. So huge impact of internal migration, even via remittances. Internal circular migrants in informal employment in countries such as India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Thailand, and Pakistan have been severely impacted due to loss of employment, earnings, and lockdown. And by the way, we have actually less information about internal migration and the loss of their earnings and employment than we have about international migration. James talked about the whole question of lack of knowledge and the need for research because of lack of comparable data. A lack of good data. Actually, there is less comparable data on internal migration, and this is a very serious problem. So there is a severe impact also on vulnerable groups, and this is of course also the case in international migration, but on women, and also in the case of internal migration on children. A lot of children are involved as migrant child laborers, and they were severely impacted during lockdown. They continue to be pushed into more vulnerable situations. Next, please. So, as far as internal migrants are concerned, although they do not face visa and recruitment barriers and costs, they are confronted with prolonged recession and slow recovery in the destination areas within their own countries. And many cannot foresee return due to lack of jobs. Being poorer on average than an international migrant, food shortages and subsistence income is a bigger challenge for them. Recovery may be faster in some sectors, such as agricultural, personal services, retail, trade, and others, such as construction, manufacturing, travel, hospitality, and real estate. In the source area, they face the prospects of prolonged unemployment or underemployment and are dependent on agriculture, government transfers, and programs. Evidence suggests that women are less likely to be part of the recovery process than men. So as the recovery process is taking place, women are actually less likely to be a part of this process. And women and children could be exposed to greater vulnerabilities in this whole process. Okay. Next, please. So let me conclude. Countries in the region need to urgently review their health, visa, and repatriation, emergency income support, and employment policies vis-a-vis migrants and refugees. Foreign missions, bilateral mechanisms should work urgently to alleviate migrant distress, supported by multilateral institutions and frameworks. Future recovery employment will depend significantly on the course of the pandemic. It's very uncertain. Over the next 6 months to 9 months, we will not be able to predict the course of the endemic. Policy responses to it, domestic policies to stimulate growth, and global economic recovery. So it's a highly interdependent world where all of this will matter. Countries and regions of origin will have to promote plans for absorbing migrant returnees, assess their income and emergency support plans, and provide the appropriate environment. Thank you very much. I'll stop here. Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Sir Srivastava, for giving an extensive review of what is really happening on migration and the context of COVID, particularly on starting with stringency in the lockdown, followed by what is the economic impact of the COVID-19 on different countries, and then what are the impacts on migrants, particularly on 5 major areas, and what are the policy prescriptions in these areas. Thank you so much giving all this perspective in the context of Asia. I'm sure this will also generate a lot of interest among the participants. And those who are interested to ask any questions to Professor Ravi Srivastava, please you can keep on typing it in the question Q&A box, which is available in the right side of the this WebEx platform, as well as on the chat box, which is also available at the right side. So thank you, and we will move on to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Professor Maruja M.B. Asis. She is the director of the Calabrini Migration Center, Manila, Philippines. And she's a sociologist who has long been working at the international migration and social change in Asia. Maruja holds her PhD in sociology with specialization in population studies and social change from Bowling Green State University in USA, and her areas of interest and research work include gender, family and migration, migration and development, and migration governance. She is the editor of the Asian and Pacific Migration Journal. She has also authored various publications and today will deliver her talk on Uncertain New World, Protecting Overseas Filipino Worker Amid the Pandemic. So over to you, Dr. Maruja, for your talk.
Hello. Thank you very much, Professor James. First of all, I'd like to thank IIPS and APA for organizing this conference and for inviting the Calabrini Migration Center to make a presentation. Let me try to do the share if I can. In my presentation, I will be sharing the experience of the Philippines in, one moment. I'll be sharing the experience of the Philippines in providing support and assistance to overseas Filipino workers in these very difficult times. I think I'd like to wait for a few minutes just to make sure that the content is there. Okay, one moment, sorry. Okay, and then I have to do the slideshow. Right, yes. So as I was saying, I will be sharing the experience of the Philippines in providing support and protection to overseas Filipino workers in these very difficult times. And in my presentation, I have divided into 4 parts. First, I will try to discuss the repatriation framework that has served the Philippines in good standing in addressing previous crises that we have been involved in. Then I'll move on to a brief discussion of the impact of the pandemic on overseas Filipino workers. So I think a large part of this presentation will remind us of what Dr. Ravi has presented earlier. Then I'll move on to an overview of the measures that have been taken by the Philippines, as well as the challenges that we have faced in protecting overseas Filipino workers. And I will end with by citing a few emerging good practices and lessons that we have learned from this experience. And these are, I suppose, points of references that we can also consider as we when we imagine and try to draft also policy responses in the post-pandemic world. All right. So first of all, as also mentioned, repatriation framework. As I had mentioned, the Philippines has an existing repatriation framework, and the Philippines has been cited in the international community as providing a good model for the governance of labor migration because it has set up institutions as well as a legal framework that would provide protection to overseas Filipino workers at different stages of temporary labor migration, while the workers are still in the Philippines, while they are abroad, and upon their return to the Philippines. I'd like to mention that the Migrant Workers and Overseas Filipinos Act of 1995, and as amended in 2010, it has provisions on how to address a crisis situation. So specifically, Section 15 of this particular law has provisions on how the repatriation process is going to be worked out. It provides it designates the Overseas Workers Welfare Administration as the main agency that would carry out the repatriation. And among others, Section 15 also provides for the allocation of an emergency repatriation plan. And a lot of the provisions concerning repatriation has actually been informed by our past experiences. And a very important point of reference was what happened in the Gulf War of 1990-91. Before COVID-19, the repatriation of nearly 30,000 OFWs from Kuwait and neighboring countries in the Middle East represented the largest repatriation efforts that were undertaken by the Philippines. Based on that particular experience, that has informed what later became part of the Migrant Workers and Overseas Filipinos Act when it came to provisions concerning repatriation. And one of the provisions there, which has been in practice since then, is actually requiring the employers of Filipino workers, particularly those in company settings, to submit a contingency plan on how they are going to evacuate and provide assistance to Filipino workers in case a crisis situation emerges. And in addition, in recent years, particularly in 2015 and in 2016, several government agencies also came together to draft joint operating manuals on how to provide assistance to Filipino workers in case a crisis comes up in different parts of the world. And in 2016, there was another joint agreement among different government agencies in the Philippines, which specifically refers to the medical repatriation of overseas Filipino workers. So while there are existing repatriation frameworks that are in place, and they have helped us in protecting and assisting OFWs in other crises, these were found wanting in responding to a global pandemic. As mentioned by Professor Ravi, this particular crisis is unprecedented in terms of scale, and it is a mega crisis in the sense that it is an economic crisis, it is a health crisis, it also has political implications, and it even has humanitarian implications as well. Next. So what has been the impact of the pandemic on the protection of on the situation of overseas Filipino workers? First, let me start with what is happening in the destination side. So of course, there has been massive displacement and loss of jobs. And early on, maybe around March or April of this year, the estimate was that probably around 300,000 overseas Filipino workers were displaced from their jobs. And some of the notable exceptions were in the sectors of healthcare and domestic work. And also, as mentioned by Professor Ravi, there was also a lot of irregular employment practices. So workers had to contend with shorter hours, reduced wages, and also an arrangement where if there's no work, then they also don't receive any salaries at all. There was also the huge problem of workers that were stranded. They were unable to return home due to travel restrictions and limited flights. And I'd also like to cite the special case of seafarers. Seafarers had to extend their work contracts because of delay in crew change. And this particular situation was really very problematic because normally seafarers would work for a period of 10 months and then they would have to have a crew change. But because of mobility restrictions, many of them had to extend their working arrangements. And of course, there's the health impact. And for the health impact, I would just like to cite the data on COVID cases. And this is data that is collected by the department, collated by the Department of Foreign Affairs. And as of September 29, 2020, there were a total of 10,507 Filipinos based abroad who were confirmed cases. So close to 3,000 were undergoing treatment. Some 6,727 have already recovered or were discharged, and some 792 deaths occurred to Filipinos based abroad. If we will look at the summary and their situation and distribution across the different regions, I'd like to bring your attention to the bars in green. So in all instances, whether we are talking about total patients who are undergoing treatment, total recovers, and total deaths, these are largest in the Middle East and Africa. And that also reflects, of course, the reality that a large concentration of Filipino workers are based in the Gulf region. So let me turn now to the next slide. Okay, in the Philippines, how is the pandemic being felt in the Philippines? A major challenge for the Philippines is the global distribution of Filipino workers. So practically all countries the world over, there's a presence of overseas Filipino workers, and so the first problem and the first challenge is how to extend assistance to OFWs in distress in various destination countries and how to repatriate them. Given, of course, the situation that has been described earlier about forced immobility, the limited number of international flights that were available, and the closure of borders. And then in the home front, we also have to deal with the situation of many stranded OFWs. So these are workers who just went home for a vacation, but then they became stranded because they were unable to return to their countries of employment, again, due to the restrictions. And of course, there's also the case of many stranded OFW applicants. And of course, once the repatriation process was already underway, there's the huge challenge of providing assistance to the thousands and thousands of repatriated OFWs. In previous crises, when the whole world was not affected by crises that came up before, like the economic crisis or also the experience with some health scares in the past, like SARS, there was still the possibility for workers who had been repatriated to wait out and then just wait out and then look for other alternatives where they can find employment in other countries. But in this case, it's not only the destination countries that are affected by the stalling of economic activities, but also even locally, it would be very difficult for displaced, stranded, and repatriated OFWs to be repatriated, or rather to be reintegrated in the local labor market, because the country was also experiencing a record high domestic unemployment. Nonetheless, despite the many challenges, the Philippines was still able to provide some measures of assistance to OFWs. So when it comes to repatriation, as of September 27, the latest data that is available, close to 200,000 overseas Filipino workers have been repatriated to the Philippines. And as you can see in the slide, this is broken down into those who are seafarers, the sea-based sector. So there's about 67,484 seafarers and sea-based workers who have been repatriated. And of course, a larger number of land-based OFWs reaching 127,740. I'd also like to mention, by the way, that this figure not only includes, a large part of it consists of overseas Filipino workers, but there are also other overseas Filipino workers who are counted in this figure. So in terms of repatriation challenges, there were a lot of hits and misses, particularly in the early months. So as I had mentioned repeatedly, there was the issue of limited international flights and travel restrictions. And also, as mentioned by Professor Ravi earlier, the high cost of airfares. And then upon arrival in the Philippines, there's also the challenge of limited testing facilities. And early on, maybe up until around June of this year, there was also a lack of coordination between the interagency task force, that the task force that was assigned to take care of various concerns in connection with the COVID, and also the lack of coordination between the national task force and the local government units. And even internally, there was also the issue of limited domestic flights and different forms of transportation. And what is also very sad in this particular crisis is that, unlike other crises that we had experienced before, the fear of being infected by COVID-19 has also translated into fears of returning OFWs, and this view of returning OFWs as potential carriers or transmitters of COVID-19. In terms of repatriation support, the government actually extended a lot of repatriation support. So it organized chartered flights to selected destinations. And for those who had already returned to the Philippines, they were given airport assistance. They were given free COVID testing. They were also given assistance in terms of accommodations and food packs while they were in quarantine. So they had to undergo the 14-day quarantine. And then also assistance for onward travel to their home communities. So actually the government provided a lot of support. And unlike previous crises, the support that was extended by the Philippine government was mostly shouldered by the government, and we did not really receive a lot of international funding for this assistance. And in addition, there was a one-time cash assistance to displaced and repatriated workers. So the Department of Labor and Employment had what it called the Abot Kamay and Pagtulong, Abot Kamay ang Pagtulong, or AKAP. So in English, this translates into help within reach. And actually the acronym AKAP means embrace in English. So it provided a one-time assistance of $200 to those that had been displaced and repatriated. What we can see also in the slide is also the magnitude of the people, overseas Filipino workers who are in need of this assistance. So data as of August 16, 2020 indicates that more than 600,000 sought assistance. That is, they applied for this one-time financial assistance. And so far, 272,000 requests have been approved. And very recently, the government also provided additional funding so that more requests for assistance could be accommodated. So by around July, while emergency and repatriation efforts continued, there was also a turn to providing post-repatriation support. So by July and August and up until now, we see many government agencies providing livelihood assistance. What I mean by government agencies, these are not just limited to the so-called migration agencies, but also agencies like the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Trade and Industry, and so forth. So many of these agencies provided livelihood assistance. They also provided easy loan terms to start or reinforce businesses and self-employment. And there's also the formation of cooperatives so that OFWs can also come together as a group and also have access to more assistance that could also provide more viable businesses. And many government agencies also provided online trainings. So this is really very helpful so that OFWs can also retool themselves while also waiting for other possibilities. In terms of emerging good practices and lessons learned, I'd like to mention that, of course, it was very difficult for government agencies and other institutions in the Philippines to provide information and services. And so there was really a shift to online platform in the delivery of information and services. So the Overseas Workers Welfare Administration, which is in charge of many of the welfare programs for overseas Filipino workers, they established a very strong online presence. So early on, they had to, they developed different applications so that they could track the arrival of OFWs, and also they could track the pickup at the airports and so on. But then this was later superseded by a new program and a new data collection that was introduced in June. And this is called Oasis, which stands for OFW Assistance Information System. And what is very great about this intervention is that it provides a lot of information that will help in coordinating the repatriation from the destination country down to the home community of overseas Filipino workers. And in addition, it would also link OFWs to other services like various online training programs that are offered by agencies such as the Technical Education, Skills and Development Authority. And then also another good practice that was conducted online is the regular updates that were provided by the Office of the Undersecretary for Migrant Workers Affairs. So this was conducted in various destination countries so that different OFW communities could be updated about the different programs, the status of the repatriation process and other assistance and supports that they can access. And also, it's not only the government agencies and the Philippine NGOs that were using the online platforms to deliver services and much needed information. OFWs also use the online platforms to air their needs and also their grievances with some of the problems that they have encountered. So looking ahead in terms of some of the lessons that we have learned from this experience, what we have learned is the importance of a whole society approach. So this is one of the times when it was not just the migration related agencies that were working, but also other government agencies came into the picture as well. And then there's also the importance of developing online capabilities for service providers, as well as for service groups, as well as for specific target groups. And I think I'd like to mention here that in as much as online platforms have enabled us to reach OFWs, we also have to be very mindful about the digital divide, that there could also be certain pockets of overseas Filipino workers who may not be able to who may not be internet savvy, and thus therefore they cannot access many programs and services. And what this pandemic has also taught us is really the importance of social protection. Who is going to be responsible for migrant workers? Is it just the origin country, or do destination countries and the international community also have a role in providing social protection? So I think this is one of the questions, and this is one of the topics and issues that we have to put forward in future discussions of global discussions, including the Global Compact on Migration. I think I'll stop at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Marula. And
Thank you.
Sorry, because it has been really nice to listen from you. Could you please mute your... Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think it has really brought out how a repatriation framework and working within that framework to provide services, provide other benefits to the migrant workers can in fact reduce the burden of or negative impact of the COVID-19 pandemics. I think this perhaps is a great example for many other countries as well, because effective use of data and based on data really taking decisions how actually to reduce impact of the negative impact on the migrants is really amazing. And actually the extraordinary work the Philippines has been doing in this regard is worth emulating for many other Asian countries. Thank you for bringing out all aspects of this repatriation framework and its implementation. And let me now move on to the third presentation. The third presentation will be made by Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui. Dr. Tasneem is a professor at the political science at the University of Dhaka and also the founding chair of Refugee and Migration Movement Research Unit, a premier migration think tank in Bangladesh. Her works include climate change and adaptation, migration, disaster-induced migration, drivers and impact of internal and international male and female labor migration, migration governance, diaspora, remittances, and safe and sustainable cities, etc. She has numerous publications in highly cited journals like Population and Environment, Development Policy Review, Urban Studies, etc. She led drafting of the National Strategy on the Management of Disaster and Climate-Induced Internal Displacement in Bangladesh in the National Overseas Employment Policy 2006 and was a committee member that prepared the first draft of the Overseas Employment and Migration Act of 2013. She is in the Global Editorial Board of Oxford Journal of Migration Studies. Today, Dr. Tasneem will be speaking on the impact of COVID-19 on left behind short-term international migrant households in Bangladesh. Over to you, Tasneem. We look forward to hearing from you. Dr. Tasneem, you can unmute and speak.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be able to talk in this August gathering. And my presentation, as you can see, it concentrates on very much on left behind household. So what we listened in the beginning was, you know, the global scenario. Then we came to this issue of Marla's discussion, where we heard that how government is trying to manage this crisis and providing services to the migrant workers. And now I will be presenting how the families, what migrants have faced, we have heard a little bit, but how the families are coping. So, yeah, so I would begin by saying that integration of global labor market created scope for marginalized people to benefit from globalization through accessing employment in countries of their own as well as overseas. If you think globalization has significantly contributed to increased level of international migration in terms of volume, diversity, geographical scope, etc. However, at the same time, we have also seen that current form of globalization and of labor market exposes international labor migrants to experience where decent work is deficit. So, vulnerability of migrants during crisis situation exacerbates. This is a common knowledge, and history indicate that international migrants bear the burden of any crisis disproportionately more compared to the local population. And if we go into the Great Depression of 1930s, oil crisis of 1973, or be it the financial crisis of 1997 or 99, global financial crisis of 2009-10, all demonstrate that migrants were used as the safety valve to reduce the negative outcome of the crisis. Now, since the beginning of this year, this COVID, 19, which is the largest health crisis of the century, has also again showing the other face of globalization. This particular, presentation, as I have said, I will be concentrating on how left behind family members are facing the, hardship of COVID-19. I will particularly touch on coping strategies of left behind household, and then even extent of anxiety of the left behind households that they are going through, some those who have returned and some their members who are in the countries of destination, how those anxieties are transformed into them, and nature of extent of remittance flow, level of inclusion of migrant household in existing public and private NGO assistance program compared to what Marla has presented, we would see that how migrants in the context of Bangladesh are yet to be part of any significant return policy. Coping mechanism of households through gendered lens, I would like to see. So, and then policy implications of the whole presentation. This presentation is based on interview of 200 households, and it is conducted by Bangladesh Civil Society for Migration, 9 members of those organizations in their program areas in 21 districts. They have conducted these interviews, telephone interviews, and I would say it didn't follow any rigorous quantitative methodology. Therefore, it is not representative. But what is important, that it helps understand the lived experiences of the migrant households. Now, who we interviewed, who are they? 100 left behind family members in 11 districts and 100 returned migrants, arbitrarily returned migrants in 21 districts. These, if we look into their age group and everything, female migrant around 33 years of age and male migrants around 36 years of age. Female migrants have been staying for 6 years, their overseas employment experience. Male migrants, although short-term contract migrants, but then again around 9 years of migration experience. They have a left behind family, or those who have returned, their family size is 5.1. And I will begin by stating the type of anxiety that migrant families are going through, those who have their members abroad. Again, anxieties faced by female migrant households and male migrant households are different. First, let me just highlight a little bit of experience of female migrant, left behind households. There are mostly female migrants are working in different Middle Eastern and Southeast Asian countries as domestic workers. Only a few of them work in the manufacturing sector. Again, female domestic workers are of 2 types, homebound domestic workers and outbound domestic workers and other manufacturing workers. So female homebound domestic workers, the type of problem they are facing, it's non-payment of wage, increased workload, reduced communication with family. Again, outbound workers, job loss, non-payment of wage, reduced frequency, again, communication with family is common, and anxiety, how to, if they are caught with COVID-19, or even how to survive in a country of destination where their income sources have shrunk all of a sudden because of, the employers have let outbound domestic workers just, their jobs they have terminated. So I have just given 3 examples here that will tell you that, domestic worker, a person working in 3 houses and 2 employers have terminated, and her major problem is maintaining a subsistence in a country where he doesn't have any person to or support. Of course, embassy and others are there, but their support, individual-based support, is very difficult at this, during crisis situation. What is common about everyone is that their communication with family was very good earlier, which is completely a different scenario compared to 5 years ago when communication was less. But over the years, they have phoned and they communicate with family through using email or WhatsApp or whatever. But now you would see that each and every one of them, the family members, we are listening to these things from the family members, that instead of every day, they are receiving phone call 10 days, 15 days later. Then if you go into male migrants have all kinds, different kinds of problems because they are not homebound. Some of them lost their jobs, and many of them are irregular migrant. Among the male migrant, irregular migration or migrant becoming irregular due to machination of the visa system is, they are the one who are facing the brunt of this COVID in a major way. And, health-related problems, mental stress, these things are reported continuously to the migrant families. And one family even reported a death, and he was an irregular migrant, and he didn't actually go out and seek medical help, and family doesn't know whether it was COVID or not, but he died inside his place where he was residing. Because he was an irregular migrant, he didn't dare go out. Those who have gone out, it's not covered in this study, but we have just done another study where we have seen that, those who were like male migrants, like they when they came out, they experienced arrest, detention, deportation, and their experience of return was also not very good. And when you think about arrest, many of them had their job and everything, but then because of non-payment, they came out and started doing extra things in the roadside and others, and then they were caught by plain dress police, and then they were taken into detention camps. And in the detention camps, whom we interviewed, they stayed from up to 10 days, up to 28 days, some of them in one cloth. And the food quality and everything, it's very sad to hear that even in this situation, in the COVID situation, when if you go through different documents, countries in crisis situation, that migrant receiving countries are supposed to take care, but in reality, what the migrant face is very, bad. And if you think about the wage theft that we have documented, is that those who have returned, on an average, they have 175,000 Bangladeshi taka they left in the country of destination, either as a non-payment of wage or as given loan to someone or paid for the visa renewal, this type of payment, on an average, 175,000. So this is a major wage theft that took place during this COVID crisis. Now, financial, I think I have discussed this. So what I'm saying, the stress of migrants has become a stress for the stress source of the families as well. We hardly think of what families are going through in the when the migrants are facing hardship in destination. Now, we try to understand the remittance flow during this COVID period. Of course, this data was generated during June and July. So now things may have changed a little, but these are during these 2 months. And you see 61% households did not receive any remittances over the last 3 months when we interviewed, and 39% received remittance. And how much did these 39% receive? Around 30,000 taka on an average. But when we have panel data, with that, when we match earlier, even a year ago, they were getting on an average 47,000 per quarter. And this is 30,000 per quarter. That means only less than, around $320, $30 in 3 months. So what is interesting that it is 36% less even for those 39% who received remittance. Now, this whole gender thing has remittance thing has a gender twist, as we have seen. The majority leave migrant female domestic workers are homebound. So they are the one who are able to send remittance, although some of them are not getting salary, but even then, majority of them are getting partial or other salaries. So it is the female labor migrants household who received remittance, like it's 69% who received. And for male migrant household, 70% did not remit, and for female migrant household, 69% received remittance. So you can say female migrant household receiving remittance is much higher during crisis situation compared to male migrants. Again, if you think these families, how much dependent they were on migrant remittances in usual time, you see that 57% families, for them, remittances were the only source of income. 18% for 18% families, 3/4 percentage of their portion of their household income comes from remittances. And for another half of the family income, for 14%, comes from remittances. So that it shows that migrant household depend heavily upon remittances. So if 60% households are not receiving remittances, how they are coping, how they are managing. So this is the next thing that I would like to take you through. How are they doing it? We found that these households are managing their day-to-day expenditure mainly through using 4 methods. One is loan. Then some has income of other family members, assistance from others, and curtailing expenditure. So these, pie charts show you that loan and other, things, and other include certain food item, taking out from the diet and curtailing family income. So we will discuss that a little bit later. But here, what is again important, that, dependence of loan again is more for male migrant households compared to female migrant households. Now, the other thing is food intake. This is like, we have explored that how the family's, food intake is, and you can see that 63% household reduced milk consumption, 81% reduced fish consumption, and 90% reduced, meat consumption. So consumption is one area where they compromise to cope with the situation, COVID situation, and lack of remittances. Now, it clearly shows that government or NGO, any other mechanism which are providing social protection to other groups of the society, did not provide any support to the migrant households. Not all migrant households needed support, but some migrant households did need support. And those households which has, children less than 7 years old, you can see egg consumption, meat consumption, and milk consumption has been reduced. This is, I would say, an important sort of understanding of how these families are actually coping with the crisis. Now, when they were asked like this, their income before migration, before this COVID, annual expenditure of the household over the last 1 year, you see on an average 17,000 taka. That is around $300 or a little less than $300, these households. And then now it has come down to 7,300, which is 57% drop during COVID situation in household expenditure. So tightening expenditure is the way that they maintain their, maintaining their households. And another issue which newspaper covered a lot. So we, in our program areas, we also tried to see, these are not households of this study, but it is a sort of we have grassroots program, and that is where we, around 100 cases we have found where violence against women member within the household increased during the COVID period. One case I would just mention is the case of a woman, a lady, Anwara. Of course, it's a false name. She was earlier used to stay with her in-laws, but because of her son's education, she came into a little bit semi-urban area, and then there she was living with herself and her children, and by keeping her son hostage, she was raped, and those things were taped by a local person who knew that during COVID she's vulnerable. There are not very many people around to protect her, and then she later, when she, her family came to our organization for filing sort of case and everything, and we pursued the case in court, and then this man the videotape put into all kinds of YouTube, not YouTube, like in local sort of mobile. So we have this type of cases. It's not new for migrant family, but during COVID, this type of incidents increased. And even then, like a person who died, when this family is facing no income, then again, society and the way patriarchy works, another woman, when her husband died, her family issued a divorce sort of notice, that false divorce thing, and saying that she should not get the money, that compensation money that he will be getting from government because she is already divorced. So this is crisis takes out the worst in even family, although we think that family would save these households, but in reality it may not be. So I will now just quickly go through some of the recommendations that we felt for the households. First thing is, in Bangladesh, government is very happy because remittances are increasing drastically. Why this is increasing? It has other explanations, but government thinking that migrants are remitting, so they must have money. But we have shown that 60% of the households are not remitting, and the money that are coming is because those money which used to be in the Hundi channel, now those needs are not there. Over-invoicing need of the business class is not there. Recruiting agency for $1,500 to $2,000 that they used to spend for buying each visa, that is no longer required, and gold smuggling and others do not require all these Hundi money, and they are coming. So, these situation actually shows that we need to be practical and say that these remittances, huge remittances that Bangladesh is experiencing, it is due to different reasons. It doesn't say that migrants are in a good situation and migrant families does not need help. We are saying that migrant families do require help. Social safety of distressed migrant families should be part of overall program of government, which till now it is not. And, so that's one. And then measures to be put in place to prevent women from violence and from within the family or societal violences. And the global community, the way I think they have, I would say only recently, some of the Compact and UN and others are talking about the responsibility of countries of receiving countries, their responsibilities, during crisis and arbitrary return or wage theft. All these things, issues should be discussed in global forum during Compact, GFMD, Colombo process, and in all other places. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tasneem.
So how do I take this?
Can you just mute yourself?
I'm trying to, yes, this is stop sharing. Okay. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think you have brought out very clearly the impact of the COVID-19 on the migrant families, particularly on 2 or 3 aspects. One is how actually the consumption would reduce and how one can combat such kind of a reduction in consumption by policy measures. And second is the violence part, which is the major gender issue. So all these data has been analyzed very carefully, looking at the larger gender issues in mind. Thank you so much, bringing the gender dimensions of migrants, remittances, and its impact because of the pandemic. I think that has been a very exciting presentation. And in case all the participants, those who have any questions to all the 3 speakers, please feel free to type in the Q&A box, which is there in the right side of the WebEx platform, or in the chat box, which is also kept in the right side. So we will move on to the last presentation. The last presentation is by Professor R.B. Bhagat. Professor Bhagat is a professor and head of the Department of Migration and Urban Studies at the International Institute for Population Sciences, Mumbai. He is one of my colleagues. His research interest includes migration and urbanization, demography, ethnicity and politics, analyzed through the lens of space and place as a critical framework of analysis. He has numerous publications in the field of migration and development in the context of India. His 2 recent books include Climate Change, Vulnerability and Migration, published by Routledge in 2018, and the latest Migration and Urban Transition, a Development Perspective, is also published by Routledge in 2020. Dr. Bhagat today will be talking on COVID-19 pandemic, urban exodus of migrants in India, challenges and response. So over to you, Mr. Bhagat. Mr. Bhagat, you can unmute. Mr. Tasneem, can you please mute? Okay, yeah, you are muted. Thanks.
Professor James, and for inviting. Yes.
Yes, it is visible and it is audible. You can go ahead. You can unmute. You are muted now. Please, Bhagat, you can unmute and then speak. No, you are still muted. I think, yes, now it is unmuted. You can speak now.
Is it audible?
Yes, it is.
Sir James,
yes, it's audible. Please go ahead.
Hello, is it
yes,
audible?
It is audible. Please go ahead.
Hello?
Yes, it's audible, Professor Bhagat. You can go ahead. It's audible. You can go ahead.
Migrants, it made migrants very visible in the various circles. In the media, it caught the attention. Researchers also followed. Students, lot of policymakers have shown interest in the migration research. So let me begin some of the foundational issues of migration studies to place the happening in a proper perspective. First of all, I would like to say that migration is a spatial process that connects area of origin and area of destination, and it is generally defined on the basis of change in usual place of residence. Secondly, that migration transforms space and place as it connects areas of origin and destination. Through the process of migration, it transforms space and place. And when the places are getting transformed, we define some of the places as urban. So that migration is closely related with urbanization. When we try to understand internal migration, the aspect of urbanization, we cannot miss it to put in a proper perspective. Third important aspects of migration issues in the context of India particularly, and maybe for other aspects also, that migration migration doesn't have a singular form. Migration has multiple forms. We have voluntary migration, we have forced migration, we have internal migration, we have international migration, we have labor migration, marriage migration, so many. But in this context of COVID, I would like to submit that the two forms of migration, one is the long-term migration involving change in usual place of residence, and other is the short-term seasonal and temporary migration, where migrants move for a weeks to several months from the areas of origin to areas of destination. So these two forms of migration need to be distinguished to understand the nature of development and urbanization, and also the impact of COVID. So I will be dealing with this two forms of migration to understand how migrants have been affected in the recent times as a result of COVID and lockdown. Fourth important thing is that migration across political and administrative boundaries shapes the entitlement and rights of the migrant. And it is not only true for international migrants, but also for internal migrants in a country like India. The administrative and political boundaries also shapes their entitlement and rights. And the COVID-19 has brought this thing to the fore, that it is the interstate migrant which has received a lot of attention in India's media and in the policy circles. Next, please. Next, please. Okay. So this is about the volume of internal migrants, and this is based on change in usual place of residence. And this is what we call long-term migration or simply migrants. So we have, according to 2011 census, 450 million. And out of that, 174 million were urban migrants. But as you see from this graph, interstate migration basically is a within state phenomena in India. It is the intra-district and inter-district migration that predominates. Interstate migration forms very small part, that is showing 54 million. Out of that, most of them are from rural to urban migration. But this receives a lot of attention, and because of their vulnerability and because of their exclusion and the political and administrative and political boundaries matters for them, and this is the group of people which have received a lot of limelight in the recent times. Next, please. Okay. This graph shows that seasonal and temporary migration. We have some data, and this is based on NSSO, but definition keeps on changing. So this is not, should not understand there is a rise in seasonal and temporary migration, but definition has changed. According to 2013, that is Land and Livestock Survey, we estimated that about 55 million people are in the category of seasonal and temporary migration. So out of this 55 million, mostly migrants are engaged in construction sector and manufacturing. So this is a flow, seasonal, and when I talk about seasonal and temporary flow, so every year they keep on moving and returning, working for a few months and coming back. This is the category of migrants who are badly affected due to the pandemic. Next, please. Next. Okay. So as I told you that in order to understand internal migration, we must see the pattern of urbanization. So pattern of urbanization, when we see it is South India and Western India, we have high level of urbanization, although India has 31% urban, but in South and in the Western, it is more than 40%. And it is Central India and Eastern India from where the migrants are originated. So this map shows the net out migration, and the blue color, the dark blue color shows the areas of the highest out migration, net out migrating areas. So this is basically concentrated in Central and Eastern India. Next, please. Next graph, next slide. Okay. So similar to the net out migrating areas, we also find that the seasonal and temporary migration is also concentrated in Central India and Eastern India, and particularly the state like UP and Bihar and Jharkhand. These are the important states from where the seasonal temporary migrants are originating more and more. And from there also, the long-term migrants have originated in large numbers. And this map shows about the 53 million plus city in India, which is controlling and commanding the Indian economy. The economy is becoming urban centric. Our most of the GDP, about 70% GDP comes from urban, although urban is just 31% population. And within this urban, where there are 8,000 cities and towns, but 8,000 cities and towns are not equally important. These 53 million plus cities are basically control and command of Indian economy. And within this 53 million, also there are 8 mega cities, which are again having higher level of dominance and control over the economy. And from this city, that the migrants have started moving out during the pandemic. Next. Next slide, please. Yes. So some of the cities, these are 8 mega cities of India. And All of them have very high migration, and the first generation migrants. And some of the cities like Pune and Hyderabad has more than 64% migrant population. So cities are highly dependent on migrant population. One cannot imagine city without migration or migrants. But what happens? How migrants are included in the city or excluded from the city? I think that is the important question in policy making. Next, please. Now, how many people have returned? This is a big question. And government has collected a lot of data, because while migrants were returning and when they reached their state, they were quarantined. And every state has quarantine centers right from the block level to the district level, and they have data. And migrants were also supposed to register when they were moving out, either by train or by buses, which the government has arranged. But many have also moved on cycle, on their private vehicle, and also by foot. For them, data may not be there, but for those who have moved through formal channel, the government has the data. And recently, government has reported in the parliament that about 11 million people, migrant workers, have returned to their homes. And this is the map showing the largest returnees are in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. And there are 6 states, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Jharkhand, West Bengal, Madhya Pradesh, and Rajasthan. These are the 6 states where out of 11 million people, 11 million migrant workers, those who return, I think this constitutes about more than 80% of the returnees. And these 6 states consist of 50% of India's population. Although this is not the complete data. You can see from the map, data are not given for Odisha. Data are not given for Chhattisgarh. These are 2 also migrant sending states. In Odisha, about 1 million migrants have returned, but that data has not been reported officially. So somewhere it is not 11 or 12 million people, but somewhere much larger. And this is also the interstate migrants. There are returnees who are from the within states. So we think that there may be something larger magnitude of returnees, something like close to 25 million people who have returned, and those who are migrant workers. And this is a huge number and huge challenges before India and India's economic progress. Next, please. So what are the issues? Most of the migrant workers work in urban areas or adjoining to the urban areas. And these are some of the issues which are being discussed and highlighted. And one of the issues is informality. About 90% workforce in India work in the informal employment. And out of these, about 50% are migrant workers. And when we see that who are the long-term migrant workers and short-term seasonal temporary migrant workers, seasonal temporary migrant workers in terms of flow, 7 times larger than the employment-related long-time migrant worker in terms of flow every year, those who are moving into this sector. So informality is the predominant characteristics. No job contract, and their conditions are very precarious. So, and many of them are casual laborers, casual workers. About 1/3 of the migrant workers are casual workers. Rest of them are self-employed, and regular workers. This is the casual worker which has been mostly affected during the pandemic. And in terms of social characteristics, these casual workers, a large number of casual workers come from poor background and also from scheduled caste and scheduled tribe communities. So this pandemic has affected not only the migrants, within the migrants, those who are socially deprived, they have been mostly been affected. The migrant workers are also invisible because they are not registered. There is no union, there is no trade union, and also politically deprived because their name in the voter list figures in the home constituency. So at the time of voting, they are not able to vote because they are at the destination. So there are political exclusion. They are not covered under labor laws. Now labor laws are getting amended under new codes, the new labor codes, and the earlier labor laws, particularly Interstate Migrant Workmen Act or Building or Other Construction Workers Act, those were also not effective. But now also things are becoming flexible and reforms are not in the direction of helping the migrant workers. They are not part of the urban policies and program, but one good thing has happened. Recently, government has announced rental housing for the migrant worker. That is, I think, very significant thing, important thing. Housing is very important in the context that housing is a gateway to urban inclusion. It gives the identity and residential proof for the migrant, and that is, I think, a very commendable steps. But we have to see how far this is being implemented. Social security in India, social security is grounded at the home state. So home-based social security is there. So when they come to the urban area or other states, they are deprived of the social security, again due to the identity and residential proofs. So government has announced one nation, one ration card. We have to see and how this is going to be implemented. It will be not an easy task, but these are good intentions and good steps for migrants inclusion. Okay. So next, please. Lastly, I want to emphasize, the time is short and we have already exceeded time, that we as a researcher who are doing research on migration, and a lot of interest have been shown in the migration research. But when we look at the availability of data, we find that there is a statistical exclusion of migrant. Data are not simply for knowing the scientific truth or scientific evidence, but when data are produced by the government or national data agency, the category enters into the administrative and political process, and it gives identity and visibility. For identity and visibility, also data are needed. But what is happening in India, the migration data is a least priority in census. Census of India has published data of migration only in 2019 up to 2011, and still some tables are not published. D8 and D9, which gives data on migrant workers and occupational status of migrant, is still not available. National Sample Survey has given last data 2007 and 2008, which Professor Srivastava has presented some of the facts. But we are quoting to data related with migration in 2020, which relates to 2007, 2008. So these are, I think, very important. Large-scale survey also, we have National Family Health Survey. It's not adequate attention is given, adequate coverage is given to the migration issues. So my concern is the wide data gives identity. It shows that yes, in the government sector, in the government practices, in the administrative and political processes, something is visible. So this pandemic has brought many things to the fore, and migrants' identity is now visible. So this is one thing that has happened. Let us hope this is going to be sustainable and some good outcome will come in improving the migrants' condition and their rights. So with this, I think I will stop here. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Bhagat, for bringing out issues relating to the informality, the lack of safety nets, the lack of social security, and the resultant issues in India because of the migration. And more importantly, the data gaps in migration, not only in this country, but in many countries, especially in South Asia, and also perhaps in other countries of Asia. That's a huge limitation in actually extending any further help or assistance to migrants during this pandemic or any crisis time. So thank you so much. And we would now have very limited time because we have already exceeded our time, but still it will be important that we listen to all the panelists once again, because there has been also a large number of questions which has been asked to by the many participants. So perhaps I will just raise one question each to each panelist because of the lack of time. But in case you would like to speak based on the questions, some of which you have received, you can also answer when you are answering for these questions. So, Professor Ravi Srivastava, I would like, because you have already brought in two important dimensions. One is the policy framework, which are important for actually addressing the growth rate, the reduction in growth rate at least at the macro level, as well as the effect of the bad effect of the COVID-19 on the economy. And also you have clearly brought out many issues that needs to be addressed for the migrants as such. But I was wondering where actually, in case for a Asian policy perspective, what would be the major emphasis for any government or even at the civil society level? Is it our aim should be more on giving safety nets and helping the migrants right now, or somehow to reduce the impact on the larger macroeconomic impact so that, finally the economy will benefit, economic progress will improve, and that way the migrants also will benefit? No, there are other questions also which has been addressed to you. Maybe you can perhaps address some of these issues very briefly because of the lack of time.
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. James. So I think it has to be both, because in the short run, in the next 6 month to 1 year perspective, migrant-specific policies are extremely important. And I listed some of them, both at destination and at the origins, and then the other colleagues have explained, many of them in detail. Questions of repatriation, questions of being access to health, income support, employment support to migrants at destination. As I said, by broad estimates, at the moment, 60% of migrants are still stranded abroad. So there has to be a very major emphasis on concerted action on providing them with support, health, as well as all other types of support in destination areas. And for those who have returned, I think Dr. Siddiqui's presentation brings out very clearly the areas, and also the presentation on Philippines where the support needs to be centered. However, when it comes to looking at the future prospects and even short-term prospects in terms of employment, then the revival of the economy is of utmost importance. And there we have to look at the policy, the economic policy package, the broad economic policy package which governments have. Some governments have done better than other governments in the kind of fiscal stimulus and the macroeconomic policy that they have provided, whereas others have not. But unless and the whole world is now, the global economy is so closely interconnected that the future will really depend on how the economy is, not only the matter of migration and migrants, but in other matters take concerted, coordinated action. Now, we saw this kind of framework developing in 2008-9. a framework for dealing with the economic fallouts in a concerted, coordinated fashion. And the UN, among other agencies, spearheaded this. We have not seen this happen post-pandemic. Each economy is doing its own thing. There is no, there is no thinking across the board in how to address the economic fallout and the policy fallout. So really, this whole question of, the one thing which has happened, people talk about deglobalization, is that each country is doing its own thing, addressing the crisis in very different ways. And this is really a very serious difference which has now occurred between the last financial crisis and the current way of coping with it. Thanks. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for bringing out the need for all the countries coming together actually to address the economic impact of the COVID-19. I think that is one of the important message which we, especially for the Asian countries at this time. So thank you. I think the next question is to Mr. Marla, because Marla also has brought in a very interesting aspects of the COVID-19. What should be the response of the countries of destination in actually addressing the safety nets or the whenever such kind of crisis comes in terms of addressing the issues of migrants? I was wondering if, because the Philippines is one of the countries with larger kind of interventions within the country, what kind of interventions or what kind of measures Dr. Marla is thinking of the destination countries should implement in case we really need to have a sustainable migration policy in the times of pandemics? Over to you.
Yes. Okay. Somehow I don't see the destination countries playing a very major role in providing assistance to migrant workers that they are hosting. So I just like in the area of how can the different countries of the world also cooperate together on issues that will spur the economy. I think there's also a great deal of I think there's a great scope for the international community to really also discuss how migrants are going to be supported, and also not just labor migrants, not just migrant workers, but also other people on the move, like refugees. What's the responsibility of the global community in extending support to people? Because otherwise, there's a tendency for people on the move to fall between the cracks. And there's always this question of, maybe it's the countries of origin that have to be responsible for that. But I think we also have to think in terms of shared responsibility to migrants in general, and also to specific types of migrants and refugees as well.
Okay, thank you for bringing that perspective. I think that's very, very important, especially since when we live in Asia, and because there are so much of interdependence in terms of migration, because many of the countries, destination countries, are also located within Asia. So we have to really see how, especially the informal migrants within Asia, can be better managed in the coming years when such kind of a crisis or pandemics emerges in future as well. So the next question is to Dr. Tasneem. Dr. Tasneem, thank you so much for bringing out the gender issues in migration. I think that has been really very exciting to see. And some of the questions the participants also has been asking is that, the remittances has been much higher by the female migrants, international migrants, than the male migrants. So what does it imply? Does it imply also that when you're giving the safety nets within the country, you also need to have a differential policies for the male migrant households or female migrant households? Do you have any comments on such kind of a trend?
Thank you very much. I think that is why always it is important to unfold the gender of migrants as well as those who are receiving remittance. So if you see, women are sending remittance. Okay, women, why? Because they are the domestic work, regular migration. So even some in the factories, so regular scenario. So whatever, maybe they are getting less salary, but they are getting some salary and they are sitting in. Male migrant, Bangladeshi, mostly working in construction sector and also all other informal sectors, and many of them are free visa, which is like now they don't have any job. So that is why they don't have the money to send. So when you are thinking about packages, programs, and problems, it has to be gendered differentiated. And if you look at the outcome that male are not sending money, so who is managing family without anything? It is the female left behind woman, member of my person. When it is the women sending money, 70% of them are married migrants, and it is the husband who are receiving the money. So everywhere there is gender dimension, and you are very right. Policies has to be, gender differentiated, and also which the point I didn't bring here, the child. Like if you see that the impact on children of not having income, not having sort of food intake and other things. So all these actually talks about larger policy, which Dr. Ravi Srivastava brought in, economy, how to really, again, in this case, migration policies, and then negotiation with receiving countries, and the way Saudi Arabia, if you see currently treating, sending back, and at the same time, not providing things, and within 24 hours you have to come. All these type of things are very much gendered. So I think policies government has to pursue based on sort of different sections of the affected group differently. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Actually, re-emphasizing that how the policies has to be different for it has to have a gender dimensions whenever we design policies and when we think of even policies. Thank you so much. And the last question is to Professor Bhagat. Professor Bhagat, I think both the participants as well as the others were asking one or two questions. So I think that interlinked. So I will ask it as one question. One is primarily how these data limitations can be addressed, especially in the context of a pandemic, and in case there are data limitations, and how, when it comes to the policies, can you also think of some policies, etc., which might have impacted the migrants much more than other policies? So can you just list out at least one or two policies in the context of India where you can claim that it had some impact on the migrants' livelihood rather compared to other policies? I know it's a difficult question, but still, I hope you can give a general answer.
So we have a certain thinking and attitude towards migration, but this is more of a governance approach rather than development approach. And we have example how migrants have been integrated into the development system. We have example from Kerala, whether the providing food from community effort, from community kitchen. Kerala has, I think, a very good example. Then Kerala started Apna Ghar, and this was for 1,000 rupees, rental accommodation will be provided. And then health insurance called Awas, and again in Kerala. So now there are state-specific models and policies are there, and this needs to be replicated. But major concern is that when we are raising the issue of migration, we always look at migration from the point of view of governance, not from the point of view of development. So integrating with development should be the agenda of migration policies. And we have to, I could see that there is a question on labor laws. Can I say something on labor laws also? Or
sure, please, quickly, we are going to almost wind up now. Yeah, quickly.
Yeah, so just quickly. So I see migration's problem and issues and policy from citizenship perspective. Whether their citizens' right is protected, they are citizens of the country, they are entitled to have social security program. Labor rights, they are also laborer, but labor rights is always weakened, always scattered. And in new labor courts also, this is going to happen because there are several ifs and buts. If a farm is employing 10 workers or more, then the labor laws will be implemented. But here migrants are coming one-to-one basis, one employer, one migrant. And migrants are not always contractor driven. Migrants are network driven through friends, relatives from villagers. So these are migration reality. I think first, as a citizenship, their rights should be protected. Then comes I will take labor rights later on. That is, I think, first, if it is fulfilled, later, I think there will be more effective when they will be organized in terms of certain identity or in terms of certain collectives. And then data plays an important role in that. And we must have data from NSSO. When NSSO is collecting data on employment and unemployment, why they are not collecting, I couldn't understand on migration. So that is my concern. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think it has been an exciting day and exciting panelist. I think the enormous amount of information they have actually shared today, as well as the intensity of the discussion, really shows what all things really can be thought about in the aspects of policy, aspects of migration, as well as on the collaborating on the migrations across Asian countries. I think we have dealt with the issues of economy. We have also dealt with the issues of the migrants. We also dealt specifically on the issues, specific issues in the country context, like repatriation framework, etc., how it can really help the migrants. We also really dealt with how addressing gender issues can really reduce the negative impact of such pandemics on the migrants by policy interventions. We also saw how data and really the policies and lack of such data and policies, etc., in the interest of India, etc., can really affect the livelihood and the negative can really enhance the negative impact of such a pandemic. Thank you so much. It is on behalf of the Asian Population Association, also on behalf of the International Institute for Population Sciences. It's my great pleasure to thank you, the all panelists, Professor Ravi Srivastava, Professor Marla, Professor Tasneem, and Professor Bhagat, for participating in this. We are really indebted to you for your time, your efforts, as well as sharing the knowledge with all of us. Thank you so much, and have a great day or great night ahead. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yes.
Thank you. Have you recorded this? The lecture, will it be available?
Yes, ma'am. We can regard it.
Okay.
After discussion with our director.
Okay then. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Good to see all my old friends. Marla, it's wonderful seeing you. Ravi and Bhagat. Thank you very much. It was
Thank
wonderful.
you. Thank you to all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Professor
Bye-bye.
James. Thanks, Anjani. Bye.
Thanks, Professor James. Now, where do I go? Yeah.